So during my ongoing research, I stumbled across a study which mentions an interesting ages-old thermoacoustic device called the Kibitsunokama. As with the Aeolipal, an ancient steam turbine described by inventor Heron of Alexandria and Vitruvius a generation before him, the Kibitsunokama was also described in a manuscript. The Kibitsunokama itself translates as kettle of kibitsu and is an instrument that was used in historical Japanese shrine rituals. The instrument has a long history. It is first mentioned in the Tamanin Temple Diary, written on May 16, 1568 by a Buddhist monk, and is later described as the Cauldron of Kibitsu in a tale published in 1776 by Ueda Akanari called Yujetsu Monogatari, or Tales of Moonlight and Rain. The instrument is composed of an iron bowl and a barrel that is open at both ends, with a mesh screen placed inside of the latter. The barrel is mounted securely on the iron bowl. After water is poured into the bowl, the mesh screen is covered with rice grains. When the water is externally heated, the gas in the Kibitsunokama begins to oscillate spontaneously and emits a sound that is used for fortune telling. The device is still used today during Shintoist temple ceremonies. It says here that there is a cauldron at Kibitsu Shrine in Bikchu. If you make a donation to the shrine and pray, the cauldron will sound. The more your wishes are accepted, the higher the sound the cauldron will make. Given the long history of oral traditions of humanity as compared to the relatively more recent emergence of written records, we might theorize that the oral descriptions of both the Aeolipal and the Kibitsunokama likely existed long before their written descriptions, likewise placing their origins at much earlier periods as well. It is likely that the Kibitsunokama is no more the direct predecessor of the modern-day thermoacoustic engine than the Aeolipal is the direct predecessor of the modern steam engine. But the Kibitsunokama has definitely had an influence on certain variations of the modern heat engine, particularly what is known as the rice engine. Besides the unique addition of rice, the ceremonial artifact also uses water. According to this study, water has been found to greatly reduce the operating temperature required for acoustic oscillation. Thus, the modern thermoacoustic engine, when accounting for the Kibitsunokama, could potentially have a very long, diverse, and ancient history. This doesn't mean that every ancient ceremonial device will have spawned a technological system. Progressive technological development requires many factors and favorable circumstances to coincide. But with so many societies existing over such a long period of time, the odds are indeed very good that there were periods of sophisticated technological development in the distant past. We need only look at the scale and complexity of the many megaliths to see that this is true. These structures at the very least reflect the definitive ability to mass produce hundreds, even thousands of high-quality tools that we use to cut, drill into, and sculpt hard stone with great precision, in many cases rivaling similar stonework achieved today. As mentioned in the previous Thermoacoustics video, giants are often given credit for these megalithic feats, and it seems to be reasonable. Big people moving and processing big stones. But even the strength of giants alone cannot explain these feats, especially when considering the great complexity and skill involved. Having the size and strength of a giant would certainly help, especially in the movement and erecting of huge stones, but it wouldn't solve many of the other intricate logistical issues. And to add to that point, there have been the narratives of giants building megaliths, but with the aid of high technology, rather than just raw strength alone. Interestingly, there's also at least one tradition of megalith building by dwarves. It says here that, according to a Mayan legend, the temple complex of Uxmal in the Yucatan Peninsula was built by a race of dwarves who were able to move heavy rocks into place by whistling. This fascinating legend seems to imply that the dwarves were using some type of high-frequency acoustic technique to move the great masses of stone. And of course, there are also tales of normal-sized people utilizing similar quote-unquote magical techniques. And so whether giants, dwarves, or regular-sized humans, there seems to be an underlying theme of some kind of arcane knowledge and technology. And so the question is, could thermoacoustic devices similar to the Kibitsunokama have comprised an aspect of such a technology? Like the Sondhauss tubes discussed in the previous Thermoacoustics video, and which are the key components of the Stirling heat engine, the Kibitsunokama can also be converted into a prime mover. The resulting vibrations, which would normally make the audible sound, can instead be used to oscillate an elastic membrane and attached piston. And as with other thermoacoustic devices, there is a beauty in its simplicity and how few materials it takes to make one. All that is needed is a metal container such as a can or metallic bowl, steel wool gauze, and rice, which together make up the stack, a uniform piece of dense material for a piston such as a half-inch steel nut, an elastic sheet made from cut-open balloon, and of course a heat source, as well as some water. After the sequence of steps shown in the clip, the assembled device should be heated as shown. The heat source can be an open flame or the heating element of a stove. Once the water begins to evaporate, the membrane will expand. At this point, a safety pin is used to poke several holes in the center of the pressurized membrane so that the engine can breathe. After this, further heating of the engine should result in strong oscillation of the membrane and piston. If it does not, a sharp tap for starter energy may be needed to get it going, just as with most engines. There's definitely an art to making these engines, as they may not always work the first time. Care must be taken to assure that it is airtight. The diameter ratio of the can to piston is also important. If the piston diameter is too large, the vibrations may be attenuated, while a diameter that is too small may result in unstable oscillation due to lateral instability. But after some perseverance, one can get it going. This version is the most basic iteration. Many modifications can be made to improve its performance and enhance its longevity. For instance, small beads or even small pebbles could be used instead of rice, which will eventually get soggy and sticky, mitigating airflow and hampering performance. Also, small holes can be drilled into the top and bottom of the can. The top hole can be the breathing hole rather than poking holes in the membrane, and the bottom hole can allow for the replenishment of water, which evaporates. This can be done with the aid of a syringe that will fit through the hole. The hole will have to be reclosed, however, after each injection of fresh water. This can be done with a piece of heat-resistant tape, or the syringe needle itself can just be left in. But for more powerful engines, a more vigorous solution will be needed, such as threaded nipple conduits and removable end caps. More information on possible modifications and demonstrations of them can be found on the YouTube channel entitled High Voltage Engineering by M.G. Nyasar. I put several links to some of his videos in the description below. It seems almost poetic that the Kibitsunokama can use rice, beads, or even pebbles as part of the heat transfer stack, as it points to its earthly indigenous origin, being made of earth-based materials rather than modern space-age materials. It is truly a type of organic technology. It certainly would not be difficult to imagine ancient peoples creating such devices for both ceremonial and perhaps more industrial purposes. Even the cauldron would not have to be made of metal. Ceramic material should work as well, though it likely would not work as efficiently as the metal. And since the remnants of such earthly devices would be highly compostable, then perhaps it offers a potential reason as to why it seems difficult to find such technological artifacts from the ancient world. We also have to consider that modern archaeology as an established, organized discipline did not emerge until the 1800s. And so academia must seriously admit the folly in the implication that we can fully grasp thousands of years of human development in only 200 years of study. As with other heat engines, the piston can be used in conjunction with a crankshaft, pulley, and flywheel to turn it into a prime mover. But we can also use it vibrationally. Here we can see the movement due to surface acoustic waves. It is practically a thermoacoustic vibratory engine. A weight placed on top of it might prevent it from moving, but it would still be rendered easier to push or pull due to acoustic lubrication. As an untested and merely empirical observation, I would say that the vibrations generated are nearly as strong as those generated by a similar sized electrical mechanical version. It would be very interesting to test the vibratory strength of a much larger version of this design. These types of engines are external combustion engines. External combustion engines may not be as efficient as internal combustion engines, as the heat energy of the source is exposed to the ambient air, hence almost assuring that a significant amount of energy will be lost during operation. But it may be possible to overcome this relative lack of efficiency by using resonance to build and store large amounts of vibratory energy. Peripheral passive resonators, such as tuning forks, can function as vibratory capacitors, building and storing vibratory energy, just as a rotary engine stores energy in the form of angular momentum in the flywheels as well as the road wheels. Energy can be stored and released in a variety of ways. It can be stored in the potential energy of vertical displacement, an example being the climbing of stairs. It can be stored as electrical potential, such as we see with lightning and power capacitor discharges. It can also be stored in angular momentum, as just mentioned. We can imagine the tremendous kinetic energy which has been stored in a large, heavy disk, which has been spinning for some time. Energy can also be stored in vibratory oscillatory resonance. Great power can be generated from each of these methods as long as we release the energy in less time than it took to store it. This quantity is rate of energy change per unit of time, or what we generally define as power. In theory, there's virtually no amount of power we couldn't develop given enough energy input and time. We can understand this principle further from the equation for power, which shows that for any given amount of energy, power increases the faster that energy is released. The only real limiting factors are the energetic limits of the system, as well as the system's structural capacity. We might imagine the tremendous power we could develop if we could harness the vibrational properties of the Earth itself. The Earth is essentially a giant resonator cavity, and thus would have an immense upper energetic limit. We could develop enough energy to shift the 1,000 plus ton stones at Baalbek, or even the entire 5.9 million ton mass of the Great Pyramid of Giza. We just need a reasonably potent energy source and enough time. We could see then how a tunable mechanized prime mover would greatly expedite this process. And to that end, we can see here that These thermoacoustic devices can be rather easily tuned by simply adding or removing cylinders. Removing cylinders reduces the wavelength, thus increasing the frequency, while adding cylinders increases the wavelength, resulting in a corresponding decrease in frequency. Please see the video, Ancient Thermoacoustics, linked in the description below for more information as to how frequency relates to the length of these devices. However, it's not as if the entire Earth would need to be made to shake violently in order to achieve this. Rather, the resonant vibrations would be localized, just as with an earthquake which is regionalized and does not affect the entire planet. Such a vibratory technique would be invaluable to societies not yet having the will. Wheels really wouldn't be practical anyway for such titanic weights, especially if they were made of wood or even stone. There are also many accessories which need to accompany the wheel, such as crankshafts, bearings, axles, and suspension systems, all of which would need to be made of the strongest metal alloys. And of course, roads or metal tracks would need to be placed between the quarries and the building sites. Vibratory engines would practically eliminate the need for these accessories. A smooth wooden track might still be desirable, though not entirely necessary. Compacted earthen surfaces would work just as well and would actually be much more practical. One study theorizes that the Egyptians used water to continuously compact and densify the sand just in front of heavy load-bearing sleds. But returning to the subject of the Kibitsunokama, what is its origin? Is it the remnant of a more developed lost technology from distant antiquity, which was gradually incorporated into ceremonial activities? Or was it a completely independent and unrelated development? Certainly a likely scenario is that the cauldron was simply developed to cook rice and other granular food items, and when sound was noticed emanating from it, it was simply repurposed as a ceremonial and divination item. And if this is the case, then it's very likely that such an effect will have been noticed at a very early point during humanity's long history of developing new ways to cook and prepare food. It also means that the effect and derived principles will have been known to the earliest societies. As we've taken these principles today and harnessed them for development of thermoacoustic devices such as air conditioning and heat engines, is it possible that thousands of years ago, people accomplished something very similar? Ultimately, it all begs the question, what was the ancients' relationship to technology? And how did it in turn relate to their spirituality? There is evidence, particularly from the history of Sumeria and Egypt, that science and spirituality, or magic, were not mutually exclusive. Rather, they were intimately intertwined. Some Egyptologists, for instance, have theorized that the Egyptian neter were not exactly gods in the same sense as the superpowered humanoids conceived in our own image, as envisioned in Hollywood productions and comics. Instead, the neter were said to be personifications of the elements and forces which could be influenced if certain rules and rituals were followed. The ancient Sumerians seem to have a similar outlook. But even if the ancients did personify, deify, and ceremonialize the elements and forces, that doesn't render their world conceptualizations entirely moot, as their reasonings were still based upon cause and effect. Like us, they found that if they observed and followed certain rules and cycles, enacted prescribed systematic tasks and actions, then they would most often than not attain certain results and could even influence outcomes to a significant degree. And whenever they didn't obtain the expected outcomes, then they would simply modify those actions until they did get their desired results. Sometimes this even involved the added action of summoning and imploring the spirits or ancestors, which would in turn be expected to influence the elements and forces on their behalf. So even though it is what we would classify today as magical thinking, it is nevertheless not entirely without reason and logic. We can still see elements of a rudimentary scientific method. Hence, it follows that a magical or ceremonialized worldview will still lead to the mastery of certain principles and devices. In other words, technology. And since spirituality has existed since the beginning of time, then some of these devices and principles, such as the Baghdad battery, such as the Kibitsunokama, and anything based on or derived from them, could be much older than ever imagined. Can these concepts help us to understand the status of such devices as the Kibitsunokama and the Baghdad battery? Were they technological devices or ceremonial artifacts? The Kibitsunokama has definitely been used as a ceremonial object, and it has been suggested that the Baghdad battery was as well, though there is no general consensus about it as of yet. But if the theme of the inseparation of science and spirituality is maintained, then perhaps these devices were both technological and ceremonial. This may follow as the pharaoh, represented as a god, was both the political and the spiritual centerpiece in Egyptian society, as matters of politics were not separate from matters of religion. This is certainly an interesting way of looking at the world, as today we typically strive to separate everything scientific from the spiritual, just as we do with church and state. And so perhaps some of these devices perform what we would think of as dual purposes. And as with any knowledge and technology, it would become increasingly developed and sophisticated over time. What implications could this have for the possibilities of sophisticated ancient technologies, particularly concerning implications of ancient vibratory techniques? Could ancient engineers have developed large vibratory heat steam engines based upon the principles of the Kibitsunokama or similar devices? Devices which could aid in the movement of heavy weights via surface acoustic waves, acoustic lubrication, and perhaps even sonic levitation? Could similar vibratory devices also have been used to cut and process the stones? And what about non-electric lighting, using a process similar to triboluminescence, as shown in the clips here? Triboluminescence is the emission of visible light, usually from crystalline substances that are rubbed, scratched, or mechanically deformed in other ways. But can strongly resonating the crystals, as opposed to mechanically deforming them, create a more steady state emanation of light, a type of vibroluminescence or vibratory lighting? And if so, could it offer a possible non-electric, non-modern alternative to using torches to see inside of lengthy tunnels and underground chambers? Torches which would have produced soot and reduced oxygen within confined spaces. We will search for answers to these questions in upcoming videos. Until then, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. And as always, stay tuned.